Hi everybody. In today's video, we're going to look at reading through the documentation of an API. Specifically, we're going to look at this weatherapi.com. It's an API that just returns data about the weather, right? So we can look at the introduction here. We can see that it returns things like real-time weather, forecasts, historical weather. And the idea is that over the next couple of videos, we'll build an application where we can scrape data from this API on, let's say, an automated and recurring basis, so that we can actually build, application that works over time. So you can sign up for this API if you want to. If we look at the pricing, there's a free tier which allows you to make 1 million calls per month. It gives you access to things like the real-time weather, as well as some other the API endpoints. If you're building a more complicated application, you could see, there's Starter Pro. There's different packages you can buy which provide, higher volume of calls per month. Other API endpoints that you can access. Obviously, in the free one, they only provide you with, a couple of the APIs. But as you start paying them money, obviously they provide you with more APIs and data that you can access. So I think it's important just to kind of go through how to read through the docs. Much like reading through the documentation of, say, a framework or a library that you might use, the API docs around an API that you want to use is also important because it teaches you how to interact with the API, as well as the data that you're going to get back and how you can build your application on top of it. So obviously, reading through the introduction is a great way to get familiarized. So right off the bat, we can see that it's a RESTful API that provides JSON as well as XML data. So right off the bat, we already know that this is the data format that we're going to be dealing with. And in particular, in this series, we'll deal with the JSON data structures. But it's important to know what kind of data structure you get back, because that's how you're going to be interacting with this data and operating on it. Typically, APIs, particularly when you sign up for them, you're going to get an API key, which is something that allows your application to authenticate against the endpoint, right? So that's how they know what your application has access to, how many requests you're allowed, and so on. So it's important to understand how to authenticate with the specific API. They all kind of interact differently. For example, with the API key, some of them take them as, you have to add, let's say, an HTTP header. In this case, it looks like we pass in a query parameter, which we can see down here, key equals your API key. So they all, work slightly different. So it's almost a requirement that you read through the docs to understand how it works. Another thing that these API docs give you information on is, what's the endpoint that you're going to be hitting. So in this case, we have this base API here, and then underneath of that, it gives us information about all the different endpoints. So like I said, we have access to this current weather API, and we can see that the API method is, the slash current.json or slash current.xml based on what data format you want to interact with. So now that we know, what the URLs are, we can come further through the documentation, and we'll see, okay, when we make a request, there's some parameters that also have to go with those requests. And in this case, it looks like we have to pass in the key, which is our API key, and it's required. And then this other parameter Q, which it's not exactly obvious what Q is, but if we read the description, it looks to be a parameter where we can send things like, a city name, a zip code, postal code, or whatever. But you wouldn't know what this is unless you actually read through the docs. So it's important that you kind of sift through it just to understand what you're working with. In this particular case, there's also this concept of a location object, which is specific to this API, but it's important to know that every time we make an API request, we're getting this location object that's going to be returned. Well, it gives us some information down here, the field, the data type, and the description about what that data object is. Now there's some other information down here that you could read through if you like, but we're going to skip down to the API error codes. And this section is important because obviously when we're dealing with an API, we're not guaranteed to actually get a response back. So sometimes when we're programming against this, we might have to program against certain situations that might occur. So for example, let's say there's an internal application error, we get a 400 code back. Well, maybe we have to redo that request at some point in the future, right? But if we don't handle it appropriately, we might just leave that sitting there and it's just a failed request and we don't get the data. So it's important to understand how these APIs send back errors, and then it's important to program against them so that we can be defensive about it. And we'll go through that in later videos and some strategies on how we can do that. But I think understanding how to authenticate, make a request, any other additional information that's unique to the API, and then the error codes are like the important information that you need. Now in this case, we have access to the real-time API. So down here, what this information is telling us is basically the data that we'll get back with these requests. So you can see that it has this field column, and when we make a request for the current weather, you'll see that there's a lot of information that gets returned, right? Like things like what's the wind speed or the gust in kilometers per hour, miles per hour. It'll give us the UV index. Gives us things like the temperature. When was that data last updated? It'll also give us information like the data types, and that's important because if you're building out, let's say, a database, obviously the data types should align with your schema. So that's also another important piece of information. So you can see that it has information on all of these APIs in the information that it gets back. But in our case, like I said, we're only focused on the real-time API. But understanding how this data is being returned to your application is pretty important, right? So in the next video, we'll take a look at making some of these API requests, how we can authenticate against the API, and then inspecting the data that we're getting back and how that ties back to the documentation. So if you guys want to make an account with this website, go for it, and you'll be able to play around with an API and building out a small application that interacts with another server. So see you in the next one.